Clean. Okay, we're recording. So my name is Bryan Townsend. I am the prosecutor for New Hampshire's Elder Abuse and Financial Exploitation Unit. With me today is the victim witness advocate, Sunny Mulligan-Shwa of our unit, and also the program specialist, Christa Clapp. And together we are the entirety of the New Hampshire Elder Abuse and Financial Exploitation Unit. That's not to say that we're the only entity that investigates and prosecutes these cases, but we are really the primary resource to do so in the state. So what I'll do just briefly is introduce myself. I've been at the Attorney General's office now for 7 years. Half of that time was spent in the Medicaid Fraud Control Unit, where I investigated and prosecuted cases of elder abuse, financial exploitation, and neglect occurring in long-term care facilities, so assisted living facilities and nursing facilities. And then in 2019, the position opened up for the prosecutor of the Elder Abuse Unit. And I had worked with Sunny in my capacity with the Medicaid Fraud Unit, and so it was a good fit. And so I jumped over there, and I've been here for about 4 years now. So that's a little bit about me and my background. So I'll kick it over to Sunny to explain a little bit about what she does and her background.
Hi there. As Bryan had said, I'm the victim witness advocate for the Elder Abuse and Exploitation Unit. And in that role, I work, I'm not like a prosecution-based advocate, unlike, say, a crisis center advocate. My role is to work with victims throughout the prosecution process. So once we indict a case, I jump on board and I keep victims informed as to what's going on with their case. I hope to provide them with a voice in the case, and just basically stay without them as a support throughout the case, connecting them to services where applicable, or if they are appropriate, if they are in need of some services. Oftentimes this is counseling to deal with trauma. So that is one of the roles that I play, just because of our office and the way things are structured. I occasionally do have to jump onto homicides and Medicaid fraud, and occasionally right now I'm on a large consumer case because of the number of victims on it, and also because of their ages. So I sort of I do the gambit here at the Attorney General's office when it comes to victim advocacy. My focus is, though, very much the elder abuse and exploitation. We also have, as part of the component, I'm a grantee. I've been given a grant by VAWA, and so part of my grant is to do outreach into the community. And so I also do a number of presentations throughout the state, and being the Attorney Generals, we do go literally from Pittsburgh down to Nashua. So we present throughout the state.
All right, Christa, you're up.
And I'm Christa Clapp. I am the Elder Abuse Program Specialist here. I joined the unit in October of last year. Prior to that, I worked as an adult protective services worker investigating allegations of abuse, neglect, and exploitation. And so currently, as the Elder Abuse Program Specialist, I also provide some outreach with Sunny. We do some presentations, did one yesterday in Plymouth. I, kind of keep track of all the trends and statistics and the cases as they come through. And I'm coordinating 2 elder abuse multidisciplinary teams to address these cases through court and hopefully achieve better justice outcomes. So that's me.
Thank you. So the first thing that we'll talk about is the purpose of our unit and kind of what we're made up to do. And that is really primarily to investigate, prosecute, or prevent, investigate, and prosecute crimes of abuse, neglect, and financial exploitation perpetrated against New Hampshire's older adults. And when I say older adults, that's basically statutorily defined in New Hampshire as anyone 60 years of age or older. And so that's really the target population. And as I said, we're staffed by 1 full-time prosecutor, myself, a victim witness advocate, and a program specialist. Fortunately, we were lucky enough in this next budget cycle to increase, basically double our unit by getting a new paralegal, a full-time investigator, which we currently don't have for ourselves, and then also another prosecutor. So right now we have more work than we can possibly handle, and so that will go a long way to really helping us to investigate and solving and bringing to justice more of these perpetrators. So the unit itself was created in 2016. I put an asterisk there because there had been a prior elder abuse prosecutor who had been in the office for quite some time. He left in about 2012. And with him left a lot of knowledge that had been put to good use over the years. Unfortunately, so there's about a 4-year gap where this office was not doing a lot of this work. And with the passage of a 2015 law that sought to target financial exploitation, and in particular targeting fiduciaries who exploit their role as guardians and attorneys in fact under a power of attorney, the unit was formed as a result of that. So our main duties taken from that kind of major purpose are twofold. The first is to investigate and prosecute abuse and exploitation of older adults. And that's primarily what we do. As Sunny mentioned, she works closely with both victims and witnesses. Victims after a case is charged, because there is a victim bill of rights that we have to abide by, and then witnesses in helping to prepare for trial and things of that nature. And then I do the bulk of the prosecution. I, with assistance of some other attorneys around the office, I bring charges against individuals. I indict individuals, and I go to court if it's time for a jury trial. I participate and I plead cases out depending on the circumstances. But an equally important thing that we do is this right here. We go around the state and speak to anybody really who will listen to us in order to encourage, number one, reporting of any sort of abuse. We are a mandatory reporting state. Every person in New Hampshire is a mandatory reporter for vulnerable adult abuse. That's 18 plus. Of any elder abuse, neglect, or financial exploitation wherever it occurs. And our hope in doing that is to, number one, increase reports, and I'll explain why in a minute. But number two, just to try and warn people. We talk a lot about scams, and we present on popular scams that are targeting the older adult population. And the reason we do that is because once a person is scammed and they lose their money, typically they're not getting their money back. So the best way to solve that is to make sure that people are aware and that they don't lose money in the first place. So, why an elder abuse unit? I think that question is starting, the answer to that question is starting to become clear. But I don't know that it was several years ago when the unit was started. And the reason is that elder abuse is a big problem, and it's only getting worse. 1 in 10 older adults are victimized every single year. That equates to about 5 million people in the US every single year. And the problem with that is, according to studies, as best that they can tell and measure it, only about 1 in 14 cases are ever actually reported. And that's for a variety of reasons. The embarrassment that comes along, especially when individuals are taken advantage of by a trusted friend or family member, people who are just, nervous about losing their loved one, people they rely on. There's a lot of vulnerable elderly adults or older adults who are exploited, and they just have nowhere else to turn, and they are completely reliant on their exploiter. And so we want to encourage reporting. So how does this break down for our own state? We have about 1.4 million people. 280,000 of those are older adults, 60 plus. So that 1 in 10 statistic, you take that 1 in 10 stat, and that equates to about 28,000 older adults potentially in our state are victimized every year through one form of abuse or another. And then you take that 1 in 14 stat, and you see that maybe we're only receiving 2,000 of those complaints. And that actually squares with, we can never truly know the number of people suffering in the state, but the 2,000 actually equates to the number that we see per year about it. It's about 1,800 reports that we get a year. So that actually squares. But certainly we don't like the thought of thinking that there's 26,000 other people out there suffering. So as I mentioned, it's getting worse. And you see this chart here to the extent, I think you can read it. This deals with, this comes from the US Census, and it deals with population, not 60 plus, but 65 plus, and how those numbers are growing over the next several years. By 2030, we're looking at numbers of about more than 70 million individuals 65 plus, as the baby boomers, have already aged into 65 and older. That number jumps quickly by 2040 to more than 80 million. And then by 2050, we'll be just shy of 90 million. And so we have seen, and we, the stats track that with the increase in population of older adults, so too increases financial exploitation, neglect, and abuse of those individuals. So the third reason for an elder abuse unit is that these are incredibly unique cases, much the same way that, they have prosecutors and units devoted specifically to investigation and prosecution of child abuse cases. Elder abuse cases are equally as unique. And so, we talk about, there are several reasons for this. Number one, they're underreported, which makes these cases very difficult to uncover in the first place. The second reason is that there are capacity and competency issues. I have investigated and been a part of several cases, as has Sunny, as has Christa, where investigation is incredibly difficult because the victim, either during the course of the conduct or after, by the time the case is, comes to light, has capacity issues. And that certainly ranges in severity, but oftentimes the severity of their dementia has increased to such a degree that they are no longer a reliable reporter. So that makes things incredibly difficult. The undue influence, which I briefly touched on before, cannot be understated. A lot of these crimes are perpetrated by loved ones who may live with the victim, who supposedly care for the victim, are completely in charge of the victim, and the victims are completely reliant on these individuals. And so that puts them at an incredible disadvantage, and certainly lends itself to undue influence exerted over the victims. These are not easy cases either. I'll talk a little bit about financial exploitation. A lot of these cases deal with the powers that an individual has under trust documents, or power of attorney documents, or guardianships and things of that nature. So this, especially for local law enforcement, these are not your typical, oh, this person came into Walmart and stole a jar off the shelf and decided not to pay for it. They have to deal and they have to read through complex legal documents in order to figure out whether the person was lawfully entitled to the money or not. And that can be difficult. So having a unit that is familiar with these documents and that can provide support in interpretation of these documents is helpful. And then the types of offenders, most of the offenders that we deal with, or a lot of the offenders that we deal with, are not what you would consider, or what law enforcement would consider, your typical criminal who has a long rap sheet, who may have a drug history, who has homelessness issues. They are trusted members of the community. We'll talk later about a case example where one of the perpetrators was a well-respected member of the community who used to ride his own hot rods in the town parade. And so it's, these people don't have a criminal history, and so they're not what you would call your typical offenders. And then witnesses are difficult in these types of cases because these cases, they really fracture families, and we've seen that often in these cases where you'll have one side of the family supporting the defendant and one side of the family supporting the victim, and so these cases can get incredibly contentious. That makes for difficulty in proving these cases, difficulty in investigating these cases, and certainly needs some expertise. And finally, we note jury appeal here. These cases go to trial a lot of times, and juries nowadays, they want to see the law and order They want to see, the podcast, the true crime podcast that deal with homicide or these other cases. And there's this thought out there that, well, these cases where you have to go through a power of attorney or a guardianship or a trust can't be that interesting. I disagree with that. I think there are ways where you can kind of show the outrage and show the depravity of the situation and really get through to a jury through paper and just through storytelling and providing the facts of the case. So what I'll do here just briefly, and I'm not trying to train you all to be lawyers or anything like that, is I'll go through just a couple of the laws that are at our disposal in investigating these cases. The first is a caregiver neglect law. And this has been around for quite some time, but we use it less often, I think, than we would like, just because of the real restrictive nature of it. But I'll go over that in a second. And the other is the financial exploitation law that I talked about, the one that was passed in 2015, really to target financial exploitation of fiduciaries. Some of the other laws, and we'll talk a little bit about a case down, towards the end of the presentation, where we've investigated and prosecuted homicide cases, assault cases, theft is a regular charge that we bring, fraud, identity fraud, forgery, things of that nature. A failure to report abuse. As I said, everybody in New Hampshire is a mandated reporter. If you don't report, and if you have reason to believe that a person has been exploited or abused, you could be convicted of a misdemeanor offense. And then abusive facility patients, which we don't handle, that really targets individuals in long-term care facilities who are abused by the facility staff. Our Medicaid Fraud Control Unit handles those cases. So what is caregiver neglect? What does that look like? Well, it really has three components. The first is the person has to be a caregiver. The alleged perpetrator has to be a caregiver. They have to provide frequent care. It can't be just sort of a one-off. They have to provide certain services, defined services. It can be temporary or permanent. So for instance, it can occur where a person needs ongoing forever certain services, or it can be in the nature of a 3-month rehab or something of that nature, where a person is rehabbing from an injury and needs services for that period of time. And then the important part, which I think is really helpful in these cases, is that it can be voluntary or by contract. So it doesn't have to be a situation. A person is a caregiver, even if there isn't a defined contract, even if it isn't, I sit down and I can, I'm going to say I'm going to do this, and you're going to receive this, and then we're both going to sign it. No, it can be as simple as, neighbor says that they're going to come over every morning and assist an older adult with medication administration. And once that starts happening for a couple days, that person has voluntarily undertaken a legal duty to care for that individual in that manner. And so, if they neglect in their duties, which is the second part of that, all the way on the right there, if they fail to provide the care specifically undertaken, and then that somehow causes serious bodily injury. And when I say serious bodily injury, I mean the severe or protracted loss of a part of the body, right? Certainly death, which we find in many of these cases, that's severe bodily injury. Some cases are less clear, such as wounds on the body that may or may not completely heal, things like that, pressure ulcers and the like. But if a caregiver undertakes a duty, if they neglect in that duty, and then they cause severe bodily injury as a result, that individual could be charged under this provision. And like I said, we'll talk about a case later where that was charged. The next charge I'm going to get into deals with the financial exploitation piece. And there's really two portions of this law. The first portion is exploitation by fiduciaries. And that is, fiduciary is just a fancy word for, a person who has a legal obligation to act for the benefit of another. I remember, I was trying a case and we had a lawyer who came up from Arkansas, and she had this great Southern accent, right? And so I asked her what it meant to be a fiduciary, and she said, well, basically it's a do right rule, and so just means to do right. You got to do right by the person that you're caring for. And that was a perfect way to put it. It was a perfect way to put it for the jury. And so that's attorneys in fact, that's trustees, that's guardians, lawyers, broker dealers, a fancy way for saying investment advisors. And then there's financial exploitation by any person. So that's really two categories. So for fiduciaries, if a person fails to use the resources of a victim when under a duty to do so, they could be in violation of this rule, or when they use resources of a victim for the benefit of someone other than the victim. So what does that look like? Number one, if a person, let's say they are a guardian and they have to pay for that person's housing by rule of the court, and they just choose not to use that person's resources to do it. They're neglecting in their responsibilities. They're refusing to pay for that person's bill at the nursing facility. Then they violate this provision. Excuse me. Or if they use resources of the victim for the benefit of someone other than the victim. So they're required to use the money for the benefit of the victim under the guardianship, but instead they say, you know what, I'm going to take $40,000. I'm going to go buy myself a fancy new sports car instead. Then they violated this portion of the statute. The second part of this statute, which is exploitation by any person. So if they acquire possession, any person, not even just a fiduciary, any person acquires possession of resources, induces a victim to perform services, or establishes a fiduciary relationship through either undue influence, coercion, harassment, or duress, or knowing or disregarding a risk that the victim lacked capacity to consent. So some familiar examples of those would be, let's say you have a child who is living in mom's house, and mom is completely reliant on the child, and the child says, you are going to sign over this house to me, and puts a deed in front of her, or else I'm going to send you to the nursing home, or I'm going to refuse to provide you or take you anywhere or take you to your doctor's appointments. That is acquiring possession of resources through undue influence, coercion, harassment, or duress. And then knowing or disregarding a risk that the victim lacked capacity to consent. Spin that example a little bit, and you have the child who takes mom to the doctors. The doctor at a recent visit says, listen, your mother has the severity of her dementia has increased to such a degree that she can no longer make her own financial decisions. And the son that night goes and gets a deed and has mom sign over the house to him. He's violated this portion of the statute. So just some examples there, and I'm happy to answer any questions that anybody has about these statutes. The mandated reporting law. Sunny, do you want to talk about mandated reporting?
So this basically is that when Bryan said every person in the state is responsible for reporting, and that includes they must report any form of abuse, neglect, self-neglect, exploitation, and living in hazardous conditions. What's not here actually is sexual abuse also. It's hard to believe it happens, but it does, and we have prosecuted those cases. Self-neglect also is sort of a two-pronged thing. Some of the self-neglect cases refer to folks who just are unable to take care of their daily living needs each day. They might be ending up not being able to feed themselves properly, not being able to get groceries, not being able to work with their money, not being able to care for the pets they have, hoarding situations, things like that. But it also encompasses scams, is how the Bureau of Elder and Adult Services now categorizes victims of scams, because it's through giving away money to scammers that they put themselves in a situation that might be and sort of damaging to their everyday living, their ability to pay bills and things like that. So those are the categories that you are required to report. So if you're going to, if you have a case and you have to report it, and it's, by the way, RSA 161F, you can make an oral report, and that's by calling the Bureau of Elder and Adult Services. The number is there on the screen. Now they work a regular work day, 8 to 4:30. So outside those hours, you can report to local police, who then have the responsibility of making that report to the Bureau of Elder and Adult Services. We often sort of suggest to folks, if they really are concerned, that they do both report to the Bureau of Elder and Adult Services and to the police. It just in the sort of sense, especially if there's any urgency to it, but doing both is sort of what the belts and suspenders, I guess you'd say. So what happens next if it's not they get screened in? Actually, Christa, seeing as this is your expertise, would you like to take this one?
Sure, as soon as I unmute myself. So what happens next? So if the report isn't frivolous, it'll be assigned to an adult protective services worker in one of the district offices, and there's 10 across the state, and they'll begin an investigation. They have to begin that investigation within 72 hours of receiving that report, and that involves calling the alleged victim, speaking to them, hopefully seeing them face to face, although adults in the state of New Hampshire have the right to refuse adult protection from coming to their home or to see them in person. But they'll meet with them and they'll gather as much information as they can. And that involves maybe getting bank records, maybe getting law enforcement records, maybe talking to a doctor's office, depending on what the allegations are and what they find out when they talk to people. They also talk to any alleged perpetrator if they're named. As Sunny mentioned in the scam reports, so many of those are not named, the alleged perpetrator, and that's why they come as self-neglect, because there is nobody for elderly and adult services to speak to other than the victim and the bank and the law enforcement. So law enforcement referral may be generated. It's actually required in any case that APS suspects or knows that there was a criminal aspect to the allegation. And that's most of what they deal with. So many reports of theirs also go to law enforcement. It'll go to the local police department or state police in those jurisdictions that aren't covered by local police departments, sometimes sheriff's departments as well. It comes to the Attorney General's office here. It comes to several of us here, those reports, because it may be ours in the Elder Abuse and Exploitation Unit, or as Bryan was speaking of, it could be the Medicaid Fraud Control Unit. And then they work together to investigate and hopefully achieve a good justice outcome. But BEAS will generally focus on what's best for the victim that's in the case. So what can they do? What does that victim want them to do? And how can they make sure that their basic needs are met and that they're not still spending money on scams, or they are able to get their groceries, and they will address the social needs that they become aware of.
If I could add something here, a lot of the times people say to us, well, I made a report and nothing happened. And so that comes from a few areas. One, as Christa has already mentioned, sometimes people just refuse to allow you into their home and refuse to talk to you and refuse to have anything to do with you. And that is their right. So that can make it very difficult. But also, Adult Protective Services, they can't share their investigation with people. Statutorily, they just can't. And by their rules, they can't. And so while people think nothing's going on, there could well be quite a bit going on behind the scenes. So just so people are aware of that, because we have had frustration voiced to us.
Absolutely, and that's a great point, Sunny. Oftentimes when I was a BEAS worker, I'd have somebody call and what's going on with this report, and I really wouldn't be able to tell them. And I could give them basic information that if you've made a report and it was screened in and assigned, then somebody will be contacting you. But they are not allowed to tell the reporter the outcome.
Perfect. Thank you. And so finally, I already mentioned this briefly, but what happens if I don't report? Well, any person in New Hampshire who knowingly fails to make a report required by the statute is guilty of a misdemeanor. And the unit has charged this before and has convicted on this before. So it's something that we have at our disposal. Ultimately, it's important that these referrals are made because this is how we get the vast majority of the cases that we prosecute. So how do we get our, referrals? And like I said, most of it comes in through the Bureau of Elderly and Adult Services to us. But at sort of a baseline, it comes in from anybody. It's family, neighbors, caregivers, medical staff are required reporters. Financial institutions have their own internal rules and are getting far better at reporting. And actually, a new statute allows most financial institutions to freeze transactions that they believe are fraudulent or would result in financial exploitation. Police departments have their own duties. So if they get a report, they have their own duty and obligation to report that to the Bureau. And attorneys have their own, they're required in most situations to report, with the exception of just a few cases. So we encourage reporting not only to the Bureau, but also to local police departments. And from there, that just ensures that the case is investigated as quickly as possible. BEAS is not an emergency organization. They aren't capable of sending anybody out to a scene immediately to get information. So that's why we request that people report immediately to local law enforcement, so that those individuals can evaluate whether it's something that needs immediate investigation. And then from there, we get the law enforcement referrals, from BEAS, and then the local police department also calls quite often, or will email with cases maybe that were not on our radar. And then we also get direct referrals from any of the reporters listed there. So sometimes they don't know to contact BEAS, they don't know to contact the local police department, and instead they just contact us directly, which in those cases, sometimes we open investigations directly, other times we report those to BEAS or have them report to BEAS and sort of start the process that way. Sunny, would you like to go over a few of the signs of elder
Sure.
abuse?
So these can all coexist, by the way. So when you're working with older folks, for physical abuse of an elder person, you might see bruises or grip marks. You might see repeated unexplained injuries, like the person who comes in and they have the bruise on the side of their face, and then they have the bruise on the arm, and it's like, oh, I'm just clumsy, but they're clumsy kind of way too much. But just not being able to give a plausible explanation for it. And sometimes they're just very dismissive. Oh, that's nothing. That's just nothing, that type of a thing. The difficulty with physical injuries is that a lot of folks, as they're aging, are put on blood thinners. And so they can just bruise really easily. So while we say, don't immediately assume everybody's being abused, but don't dismiss it either. And if there's really a question, again, the best thing you can do is to report, because then put it into the hands of the professionals, as in, adult protective service workers, to determine if everything's all right. Neglect can be seen as sort of a lack of food and water. You might see someone who used to have, just would be meticulous, and suddenly there's that lack of basic hygiene, and that can either be at neglect by a caregiver, or it can also be neglect of themselves, that they're just not able to keep up anymore. You might see sunken eyes as bit of weight loss, and again, sometimes this is an aging thing, and sometimes it's just because they are not able to care for themselves, or their caretaker is not caring for them. For psychological, sometimes you might see someone who is always sort of a chatty person, very, fun and engaged, and they suddenly might become unresponsive. They might become uncommunicative. Some of that is always concerning, because you don't know if they are being intimidated by a caretaker or a loved one. If there's sort of that suspicious type of behavior and fearful, if they suddenly have this brand new friend that's always with them, it might be a caretaker, it might be a friend, it might be a family member, but they don't seem to want to answer anything or talk to you directly without looking over to that person who's with them, who's accompanying them. There might be someone, one of the things we've seen, where there's suddenly a lack of interest in any social contact. This also sometimes plays into financial exploitation, but it might be someone who's being isolated by their abuser or their caretaker or their family member or a friend. And I say friends loosely, where they're the person who went on, say, every bus trip with the senior center, or they were always game for anything, for going out to dinner with the friends or whatever, and suddenly they're not able to do any of that anymore. They're withdrawing from regular contact. And then just the unexplained changes in behavior. And with aging citizens, we know that this can come with cognition issues. It can come with a lot of things, but it might also be a sign that they're being psychologically abused. So as I'm saying, these can coexist, all of these things. For financial, life circumstances don't match what's known about the person's financial assets. One of my very first exploitation cases was a gentleman who was being cared for. A woman was coming in to help him with his groceries. He had had a surgery and she was sort of cleaning for him a bit. And she was getting groceries for him and going for his prescriptions. And an old friend of his showed up and she said to him, "Hey, let's go grab a cup of coffee." And he said, "I can't afford a cup of coffee." And his social security check had come in the day before. So that meant that something was happening. And she started, I laugh about her. She was a wonderful person, but she was not going to leave me alone till our office looked at it. I will tell you that right now. And sure enough, this woman was totally taking every penny this man had. She had changed his credit cards over to her mailing address, so he wasn't seeing his statements. And she was basically emptying the account every month when his social security or his pension came in. You might see in statements just these large unexplained withdrawals for the person who every month, does the utility bill, the grocery bill, the cable, the taxes, the rent, whatever it is, those normal bills. And suddenly there's these unexplained large withdrawals. There's also times when we've seen this where someone will remove checks from middle of the checkbook or the back of the checkbook so that it's not immediately noticed. Or there's just signatures that don't match. We do a lot of this. We currently have a case in this instance where someone was signing the checks of an older citizen and it wasn't her signature. They were just taking the checks. It was someone who was doing some caretaking and they were just taking checks and writing them to themselves. And as I'll say, I can't say enough about how so many of these can coexist. And sometimes some of these might be an issue with cognition or inability to just do daily living skills, but it might also be any of the reporting categories. And so the Victims' Bill of Rights, which is what I work under, is RSA 21 M8K. But it's what it allows for victims is that they need to be treated with fairness and respect, and they have the right to be kept informed. And I say the right because sometimes they don't want to be kept informed. I've had people say, "Just tell me when it's over and let me know what it's about." Or, they just want to get little pieces. They don't want too much detail. But a lot of times then there's the people who will show up to absolutely everything, whether it's a 5-minute hearing or a 5-hour hearing. They will be sitting there with me in the courtroom because they're not going to miss a piece of it. And oftentimes I believe that's them sort of taking control of the situation where it had felt very out of control when they were the victim. They have the right to confer with the state, so I'll often line up if they're asking a lot of questions about the case and they're feeling uncomfortable. I'll line up phone calls, say with Bryan, and we'll sit and we'll talk with them, or we'll meet with them personally, go out to their homes and just walk through what's going on as much as we can. Oftentimes they want to know a lot of details, which we can't give them in the midst of an active investigation because they're also witnesses. So we can't always share everything, but that's explained to them at the very beginning. But they're allowed to be notified on everything that's going on. They're allowed to be present at everything. If it's a very contentious type of thing, we make space for them at the courtroom where they can be not in the main fray or having to face the defendant. And if we prevail in a case, they're also allowed to make a victim impact statement, which we help them with. And that's the one time I will say in the whole criminal process where they get to say whatever they want. And that sometimes can be healing. It can be just sort of give them again some of that control back. So we assist with that. We also assist them with signing up for victims' compensation. It might be for things like counseling. A lot of people would like it to do restitution. It does not do restitution for financial cases, just to be really clear. But it does do in homicides. It will do funeral expenses. It does crime scene cleanups. It does things like that. But often these cases, people want counseling and we can help with that. We also do notification from the prison. We sign people up if they want to be notified of any changes of status for the person once they're in prison. The victim witness office, we don't close our files. They're always open because there's often things coming back. And especially with homicides, there's a tremendous amount of stuff goes on even after they've been incarcerated. And with all of our cases, appeals, we keep them informed if there's an appeal on the case and what the status of that is. So it's sort of an ongoing, but basically the right to fairness, respect, and to being informed.
So this next slide here, I feel like I'm basically preaching to the choir, but we go around and we talk to a lot of different people who may not be familiar with speaking to older adults. And the do's and don'ts about, what we've learned, and certainly what we try and teach law enforcement, which is, the principal actor who's going out to meet with law enforcement. So just to run through these briefly again, I know I'm for the most part preaching to the choir here, but, try not to put words in their mouths. And what I'll say is, this is important, especially in our investigations, because oftentimes, when law enforcement interviews a potential victim, there's a friend, maybe someone who even helped report the crime, who's there nearby and knows the story and has talked to the older adult victim before and wants to tell the story for them. But it's important that you don't put words in their mouths, that you let them speak for themselves and explain what actually happened, because that's the only thing that we're going to be able to use at any sort of trial in the case. Obviously don't yell or assume that they're deaf. Sunny likes to tell the story of when she went out with a law enforcement officer and they still weren't sure after several meetings which one was the person's good ear, right? Yelling into both ears and trying to figure it out. Yeah.
She had no good ears and she had no hearing aids.
So. Right. Try and keep things simple. When you're trying to delve into what has gone on and try and figure out what happened to this individual, don't ask compound questions. Ask very straightforward, short, direct questions. Try not to rush them. Everybody speaks in their own time, and it may take some time for a person to open up, especially a person who has been physically or sexually abused. And don't expect them to be crystal clear right off the bat, especially someone who has sustained some level of either physical or emotional trauma. Do be attentive and listen carefully. If they have a title, try and use the title until they give you permission to do otherwise. Reduce background noise. Older individuals, obviously, especially those individuals living alone will listen to either the radio or the television. And it's perfectly okay to ask them to turn it off, or you can just say, I'd really like to hear you better. Is it okay if I, turn down this television or turn off the television? Come down to eye level. And this is big for when we talk to our law enforcement officers, because, oftentimes when they're standing up, the gun is right in the face of the victim, which you never want. And then be aware of possible cognition issues. And I'll say that, it's important. We talk about mandatory reporting and reporting of potential crimes to law enforcement. It's important when you do that, if you suspect that the victim has cognitive issues, make them aware of that. Tell them that. That's important evidence and important facts for law enforcement to have, and for BEAS to have when they do their assessments. So what I'm going to do now is we're going to go through a couple of cases. One is a financial case. The other is a neglect and homicide case, just to kind of give you a feel or flavor for how do these things develop? What do they look like in practice? And so the first case is a case, State versus James and Karen Farley. And this was a case I did early on in my career. It involves a victim by the name of Barbara McEnany. She was born in 1934. That's Barbara right there. And a wonderful picture of her with a dog. Barbara unfortunately lost her husband, Chuck, in 2006. It was Chuck's second marriage. He had children in a previous marriage, and Barbara and Chuck never had any children of their own. Barbara unfortunately was diagnosed even before 2006 with Parkinson's disease, and it limited her mobility to such a degree that at a certain point she needed a wheelchair, as you can see there. She needed assistance with most of her daily living activities, including, at certain points, walking around, bathing, and things of that nature. Now, when we started interviewing on this case, what everybody said about Barbara, it was the same thing, that she was frugal. She was the most frugal person they had ever met. And you can see by this pie chart here that she truly was. I mean, this is a picture of Barbara's spending in a 2-year period, the beginning of 2010 to the end of 2011, where she spent 90% on housing, 8% on, this is her entire spending, 8% medical, less than 1% retail. I cannot say that. Less than 1% cash, and then charity less than 1%. Barbara loved to give, but she gave in very small amounts. St. Jude's she liked to give to, but she would give every once in a while for $10 a piece. And you see that cash there. Barbara consistently wrote by check. She did not go online. She did not go on the computer. She did not have an online account, so she didn't do mobile payments. She did not have a cell phone, so she wrote checks. That's what she did, and every once in a while she would grab some cash.
Brian, I love the frugal part. We were told that she would go to the bookstore locally when she was able to go out on the field trips, and she would buy the used books. And then she'd go back and she'd trade in her used books for more used books so she could get discounts on discounts. And that was just who she was. But she came from, she didn't come from big means, and she'd saved and worked very, very hard. And everything she had was, came by honestly, so to speak.
Exactly. And to that point, she was not a wealthy woman, but by the time 2011 came around, she was moving into a new assisted living facility. And she had scrimped and saved, to have a nest egg of about $170,000. And so she had monthly income from Social Security and a small pension for $2,000. And so what she did, as is often the case with some of these long-term care facilities that don't accept Medicaid, is she made a deal with them. So her room at the facility, which was a very modest room, one of the smallest they had, it didn't have a kitchenette or anything. It was just a small 1-bedroom. They said, we'll accept on a monthly basis your rent. And then as long as you pledge the $170,000 to us, we'll take that money. And when you run out of that $170,000, we'll keep you here for just your Social Security and your pension, so $2,000 a month, regardless of how expensive the actual room is. And so that's the deal that Barbara made. And they expected the resources to last approximately 5 years. But less than 2 years later, she only had $777 in her bank account. So the question became for us, when we got the reports, why that was. And this is James Foley here on the right, and that's Karen Foley on the left. James is Barbara's younger brother, younger by about 16 years, and that's James's wife, Karen Foley. And so James, when Barbara moved into the assisted living facility, said, you know what, Barbara, I'm going to help you out. Why don't I become your power of attorney so I can, help you out with certain things and pay for certain things on your behalf. So James becomes a power of attorney in September 2011. What he also does is he convinces Barbara to sign to allow him to be on her bank account as a cosigner. And he was very clear about this when he was interviewed later, that he was only on the account so that he could get a debit card and pay for things that Barbara needed. Barbara clearly had mobility issues. She couldn't get out of the facility and buy her own toiletries and things like that. So the debit card and James being on the account was strictly so that he could buy things for Barbara. All of the money in the account was Barbara's money. As it moved forward, though, in a few months later, in April 2012, Barbara continued to decline physically. She also started to have some memory impairment. And what James said to her at that point was, well, you know what? She was still getting the bank statements sent to her at the facility and reviewing them each month. And what James said is, oh, Barbara, why don't you let Karen and me get the statements to our house so you don't have to worry about anything. We'll take care of it all. And so that happened. The change occurred in April of 2012. And after that point, this is a graph here of the net worth, Barbara's net worth after that. And as you can see, the account is drained after that point, resulting in her having almost no funds by September of 2013. So some obstacles by the time we got the case included that Barbara was not competent. The severity of her dementia had increased to such a degree that she wasn't even able to speak to us. In fact, Sunny really had no involvement because Barbara was unable to communicate. And she was unable to really understand anything that was going on. The power of attorney that was given to James provided that he had broad powers to handle her finances. Importantly, it also had a provision that he had to act in her best interest. And James was the co-owner of the bank account. What a lot of people don't understand, though, is in New Hampshire, a co-owner of a bank account can be convicted of stealing from the other co-owner. Now, that doesn't occur in situations where it's a husband and a wife and they share the account and they're both depositing things. But in a situation like this, where a person is on the account, another person's account solely for the purpose of assisting them, that's the question. What is the arrangement between the parties? It doesn't matter if they have access to the account. What is the arrangement? And here there was no question that the arrangement was James was on the account for the sole purpose of assisting Barbara. So we were able to overcome these deficiencies by really a coordinated effort by several individuals. And really this is a textbook example of the way that the system is supposed to operate. The facility and the facilities council, so Barbara's long-term care facility, they were the first ones really to understand and realize that something was going on, because the facility was dealing mostly with Karen and James in terms of getting paid each month. And when they started to have trouble getting paid, the facility owner said, hey, what's going on here? She was supposed to have finances that were going to last 5 years. Why is she running short less than 2 years later? And in speaking with them, they made some incriminating statements, including Karen, who told the facility that, I don't know what happened. I guess we weren't careful, things like that. And then the Medicaid office, what a lot of these perpetrators think is that, oh, I'm just going to take all of my mother's money or my father's money. And what I'm going to do next is I'm just going to put them on the state's dime, right? I'm just going to sign them up for Medicaid. But what they don't know, what they don't understand is that Medicaid has a 5-year look back period where they go through and they do an investigation of all of the person's finances for that 5-year period. And that's exactly what they did in this case. And actually, it was great testimony at trial. The individual who interviewed James and Karen to put Barbara on Medicaid, again, she wasn't representing herself anymore. They were doing the bulk of the speaking because of her dementia. That person said, describe their faces when they were told that there was going to be a 5-year look back and investigation of the finances. And she said it was just panic by both of them. And so what Medicaid did is they received a bunch of the statements that James and Karen, after James and Karen had the debit card and after the address had been changed. And there were a lot of expenditures, debit expenditures for large scale cash withdrawals, online expenses, Amazon, Bed Bath & Beyond, things that had never taken place before Barbara gave James a debit card. And so they handed those statements to James and Karen, and they said, why don't you explain what these were? And as I'll show you in a minute, that was some of our best evidence. And then APS, actually the facility was a mandated reporter. They notified APS. Medicaid office, mandated reporter, notified APS. So we didn't just get one referral in that case. We got 2 law enforcement referrals in that case. Both, so it sort of showed, what these types of referrals can do, in getting things speedy and getting things to us. So APS did an investigation. A very good service worker for APS investigated the case, interviewed James and Karen twice, really grilled them and talked to them at length about the expenditures. And so as we go through here, this was just an example that we used at trial. And so it says here, this was part of a bank statement, Amazon Prime purchase for $79. Now, Barbara never had a computer. She didn't know how to use a computer. She just certainly didn't have an Amazon account. So James and Karen wrote, this expense was so that Barbara had free shipping. But we went and got the Amazon receipts, and it turns out it was not Barbara's account whatsoever. It was Karen Foley's account. And the account was used to buy tools, Emerald Lagasse cookware sets, and a deluxe ferret cage. And certainly these were not items that Barbara, a person with Parkinson's disease and suffering from dementia, would have been using in a long-term care facility. So we knew that these items were for James and Karen. There were Shaw's purchases for $151, and there were some far in excess of that. So what we did is we requested receipts. James and Karen wrote that we bought fruit and candy to make baskets for nurses. The first problem with that was we interviewed the facility and they said that that never happened and that their nurses were not allowed to accept extra gifts except for small donations, monetary donations for a party at the end of the year. And they said specifically, Barbara, James, and Karen never donated. So we got the Shaw's receipts, and it's a little small, but basically what we found was that these are not items that you would put in any gift basket to a facility. There's Diet Pepsi, meat, chicken drumsticks,
Cigarettes.
Right, lots of cigarettes, yeah. And that was the other thing is James was a smoker, Barbara was not. And so there's lots of cartons of cigarettes that we saw in the receipts. So again, we knew that was for James. And the fact that they were lying on the statements showed us great evidence that they were committing financial exploitation. And then we had some Bed Bath & Beyond purchases, $152. They claimed it was new bedding and curtains for Barbara's room. And then $387 waterproof mattress covers for Barbara. And then an $83 charge for pillow and mattress covers for Barbara. In reality, it was a soda maker, more cookware, and a KitchenAid mixer. So again, Barbara didn't have any need for a KitchenAid mixer, nor could she even lift one of those things. I can barely lift one of those things. And so we knew that was not for Barbara, that was for James and Karen. So we ended up charging them with counts of theft and financial exploitation. The difference in the amount there is that Karen was charged with $44,000. That was a mix of online expenses and cash. And so James was also charged for the online expenses and cash. But in addition to that, he was the power of attorney, so he was charged with financial exploitation. And what he did at one point was he clearly got tired of just sort of nickel and diming. And so he went into the bank and just withdrew $50,000 that he claimed was an inheritance that Barbara wanted to give him early. There were two problems with that. The first is she had already pledged all of her money to the facility, so it made no sense that she would have given him any advanced inheritance. And number two, under her will, he wasn't even going to receive any money under the will. So he was never going to get any inheritance. So those two things backfired for him. Ultimately, they were both convicted after a trial, and they both were sentenced to state prison time. They both were sentenced to serve 1 year in the state prison. Neither had a criminal history. James was a veteran. And Karen had physical issues of her own, and still the judge was so outraged by their conduct that she sentenced both of them to the New Hampshire State Prison. They were also required to pay restitution. They really didn't have the money to pay much restitution, so they have paid and are continuing to pay at a very small amount each month, but they are required to pay that back.
So folks, I realize it's 3 o'clock and I think we were meant to end at 3. So I want to give you the option of whether you want me to go on. I can do this very quickly, but it's up to you. This is a case that was a neglect case that resulted in the death of an aging woman in Exeter. So if you want to let me know whether thumbs ups or whatever, I'm happy to go on. Okay, I don't see anything, so I guess I'll continue. So Nancy Parker she was born in 1941 and she lived in a mobile home park in Exeter, New Hampshire. She had some mental health issues and these were long-term mental health issues. She had neglected her hygiene for years. And this, again, was a difficult case because she wasn't a sympathetic witness or victim in a weird way. the defense had co-workers from 20 years earlier come on the stand to talk about how she would stand and urinate and defecate wherever she stood while working with them. And I'm talking, she worked in a factory and while she was working on the production line, and they talked about how difficult she was and things like that. So that made it kind of a difficult case to start with. She'd also had a lot of contact with the Bureau of Elder and Adult Services. People had made reports. The Bureau had gone out and she refused to give them any contact or to let them into her home or to have them do anything. Want to give me the next one, Brian? Thank you. So in 2014, her daughter and granddaughter move in. She's definitely had failing health. She's a rather obese woman. She had health issues anyways, and she wasn't able to do much care for herself. So the daughter and granddaughter move in with saying that they are there to take care of her. They're going to do the cooking and the cleaning, and they're going to run the errands. Bees get called out. The Bureau of Elder and Adult Services get called out many times, but they go out again. And she refuses to let them in the door, but the daughter's in the background screaming, she's fine, we're taking care of her. And she says, I know I have my daughter, my granddaughter here, they're taking care of everything I need. I don't want you people, but thank you for coming by, and no thank you. So they go away. They continue to check in, but never got access to the home. So in 2016, she does have a fall, and it's February. And where she fell, the floor on the mobile home had somewhat rotted. And so where she was lying on the floor, there was air coming up, and it's February in New Hampshire, so it was cold air, and it was coming up through the floor. She sort of had no underwear on. She was lying just in a sort of a night shirt kind of a thing, but they're not able to lift her. So what they do is they basically leave her there, and they don't call for assistance. And she, by the way, we all knew this, hated fire, hated police, she hated doctors, she didn't want anyone coming into her home. But they did try and lift her, and they couldn't. And they tried to bribe her, saying, well, we'll make you spaghetti, because she really likes spaghetti. We'll make you spaghetti dinner if you can get up. But she can't get up. So as it goes into the next day, she begins hallucinating that her grandson is dancing on the walls. Her grandson lived in another state, but she's beginning to hallucinate, basically. So several days later, 3 days after this, they Google symptoms for stroke and other ailments. And so they're beginning now they're still continuing to be worried, but still not calling for any assistance. So finally, they call on the 17th, and they call and ask for an assist with the lift. But what they say is, we need you to come and help us. And it was her daughter said, I'm not going to be responsible for this. So that was an interesting piece of information to put in front of a jury. So when they got there, when EMS got there, she initially said, well, I don't want to go. But she was found she was completely covered in urine and feces, as you can imagine, after 5 days on the floor. And her responses to EMS were inappropriate in that she wasn't clear. Cognition-wise, she wasn't clear. She didn't know what day it was. She didn't know what time it was. She didn't know what month it was. She didn't know who the president was. She really was failing miserably on the mini cog type of questions. So EMS, despite the fact she really didn't want to go, said, no, you don't get to make this decision anymore, because you don't have the capability to make that decision right now. So they did take her. She went to the hospital. She went to a hospital in New Hampshire and the seacoast, but ended up being moved up to a hospital in Maine. What they found, it took them hours to clean her, but they found that she had a necrotizing fasciitis, meaning basically it was a skin-eating disease. It was from her being on the floor for so long and the conditions of that. Ultimately, there was a choice. They could amputate limbs and hopefully should make it, but they said it's highly unlikely. She's not going to make it. Her health is not good anyways. She will die anyways. So they allowed her to die without surgeries. She died 5 days later of the injuries in that Maine hospital. So with that case, these women had taken on to care for their mother. So we charged them with negligent homicide, criminal neglect of an elderly adult. And when Bryan described that neglect statute, they had taken on that responsibility to be caretakers. And it was the wounds that she got because of their lack of care that caused her death. And they too, on the very first day she was on the ground when she started hallucinating, she was at that point a vulnerable adult. Whether she protested or not, they had an obligation to call APS and to make a report that they had a problem. And not only was it on the first day, the second day, the third day, fourth day, but when they were Googling stroke and other symptoms, they had a report, they had an obligation to report. So these women also both went to the state prison for, I do not recall, Brian, is it on the next slide how many years? It wasn't a very extremely long sentence. This was one of those cases too where Brian mentioned how this fractures families. We did have half of the family on one side of the court and half on the other. We had people supporting their sister, the daughter of this woman. And then we had some who were supporting their mother, saying that, you know, they deserve to rot because they did this to our mother. They didn't take good care of her. This had been a tragic, tragic case in that this family had a horrible history of abuse. And that definitely played into their mental health. However, they also had taken on responsibility. The state felt very strongly that we had to prosecute and could not just turn a blind eye to what had happened.
So I think we're just about out of time now. We did have a couple extra slides on scams. If anybody has any questions about scams or anything like that, feel free to get in touch with us. You know, Sunny mentioned earlier that, you know, if you know a person that has fallen victim to a scam, that person, you know, you should encourage them to notify the police department as soon as possible. So some ways to protect yourself: change accounts and account info. Don't answer the phone. Always independently verify. Don't give out personal information to someone who calls you directly. Check credit reports. Never pay in gift cards or Bitcoin or cryptocurrency or anything like that. You know, and if a person that you know, who you care about, who's a vulnerable adult, you know, is continuing to send money and won't stop, that is when you certainly have an obligation and should report that to the Bureau of Elderly and Adult Services. So reporting that to APS is important. The Consumer Protection Bureau also has a consumer hotline where that should be sent, and that's right here on the screen. Internet scams should be reported to IC3, that sends it .gov to the FBI, and then any phone-based scams can and should be reported to the FTC at ftc.gov. So that's it for us. If there are any questions by those who are currently on the line, we're happy to answer any questions that you have. Otherwise, if you are, we know this is being recorded, so if you are viewing this recording and you have any questions whatsoever, please either, you know, call us or email us. Christa's email and telephone number is not on here, but Christa is also available to speak if needed. So please let us know. Any questions?
Brian, I can pop my phone number and email address into the chat.
Perfect.
So.
And for all
Perfect.
of you, I mean, if anyone's interested, we know you're doing a lot of great work. But if there's a point where you want to learn more about scams, it is very, very, it's an epidemic, frankly. And we're seeing just so much money going out of the state. In the last 2 weeks, I've met with people and have basically seen hundreds of thousands of dollars lost to scams. So if at any point you want us to really go through a lot of stuff on scams, we do complete presentations on that. Please feel free to let us know, and we're happy to set that up or orchestrate in any way, whether it be for this group or for groups you work with. Just feel free to be in touch. And thank you for your time today.
Thank you all so much. Are there any questions before we end the Zoom?
I don't see any questions.
Okay.
All right. Well,
Brian,
thank you,
Christa,
everyone.
Sunny, thank you.
Not at
All
all.
right.
Thank you very much.
Take care.
Thank you.